Welcome to Sports Cards once again. Back in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a lot of collectors who were sports cards investors who kind of expected some of their cards to eventually be part of a good retirement perhaps, or would get them some kind of luxury items in the future. And as we know now, a lot of them, a lot of those cards that people really highly sought are now not worth that much. Some are, of course, but a lot of them, you'd be lucky to get like a nice meal out of it, even though you were hoping it would buy you a house someday. But luckily for us nowadays, we have the value of hindsight, we have historical perspective. We can take some of the lessons from that time and apply them in today's context to help us make decisions for the future. So in this video, we're going to look at what are some of the lessons we can learn from the junk wax era of sports cards that are still relevant today. All right, now as we get into these, there's gonna be some that are a little obvious to some people and some that are a little bit more hidden, so stick through all 6. I think these are quite valuable though. Okay, number 1, when overproduction is a reality, seek out less common stuff, even lesser brands. When you think of some of the most iconic sports cards from some of the junk wax era names, it's very possible that the iconic cards of theirs actually is much less valuable today than some other random cards of theirs that you've never seen or never even heard of. For example, if you were a Mike Piazza fan back in the day, you might have prized his 1992 Bowman rookie card. That was the card that most people thought of and perhaps still think of today when they think of his rookie card. But it may surprise you to discover that his 1992 Fleer Update card is actually much more valuable. The reason it is much more valuable now is because it was the less popular set at the time. Wait, what? That doesn't make sense. No, it does. Hold on, let me explain. Due to the fact that the year before, the 1991 Fleer Update series didn't sell so well, the 1992 release had a much shorter print run. It just wasn't popular enough to warrant too much of it being printed. But because of that shorter print run, nowadays, while the supply of Mike Piazza's Bowman rookie is very, very high and can be found anywhere very easily, his Fleer Update rookie is much harder to find. So despite the fact that this was and still is a less sought card, because the supply is so much lower, its value is higher. So for Mike Piazza fans, this is a harder card for them to find, so they're willing to spend more money on it than they would have on the more iconic card. So what does this say about some of today's modern cards? Well, none of the lessons in this video are direct parallels to nowadays, but I think there's still elements of it that you can take out that do apply. Now, nowadays, there are sets that tend to be considered the flagship cards, the flagship rookies, the main rookie cards of different players in different sports. In baseball, it's probably Bowman First, the first edition of the Bowman Chrome rookies. In basketball and football, it's probably the Prism rookie. But these are also sets that over the past few years have been overproduced pretty extremely. Not to junk wax era numbers, but much more than other years and much more than other sets. So with this Mike Piazza example, there is historical precedence to consider that some of the less known, less popular sets could end up becoming more valuable in the future if they had lower print runs. At least if it's a player that actually remains collectible long term. I don't think this would happen with just anybody, but for some of the players who actually do remain collectible long term, some of those cards that are from slightly less known sets but had shorter print runs, those could end up having a higher value on down the road, I would say, than some of the Prism rookies. That more uncommonly found Jaw Certified rookie, though it's not necessarily thought of today as highly as Prism or Select, it could be that 20 years down the road, the fact that it wasn't so all-pervasive in the hobby and isn't in the hands of nearly as many sports card collectors, could that help its long-term value? Again, I don't know for sure, but this is something worth considering and worth thinking about. Number 2, the artistic aesthetic and narrative of a card matter to its long-term value. When you look back at the junk wax era of cards, it isn't always the case that the most rare card is the most valuable card. Sometimes it is, but it's not always the case. Sometimes there's a certain kind of artistic aesthetic to a card or a certain narrative that ends up surrounding this card that keeps it valuable long term, even if it wasn't quite as rare as some of the other cards. Let's take a look at 2 examples to highlight what I mean by this, and then we'll consider what this might mean for modern cards. Example 1, this 93-94 Fleer Ultra Scoring Kings card. Now, when you consider how iconic this has become, you would probably assume it was quite a rare insert card. I mean, the fact that the MJ and a PSA 10 as of March 2022 can go for around $15,000 and the PSA 9 can go for around $2,500. you'd assume it was a rare card. But actually, the Scoring Kings insert from 93-94 came at a rate of 1 per 36 packs. And if we look at other cards from Fleer Ultra, this wasn't like the most rare card. In fact, we can look at some others that had the exact same pack odds and see that they don't parallel, they don't end up having the same value as the Scoring Kings. Let's take a look, for example, at what I think is the most interesting comparison, which is the 93-94 Power in the Key insert series. Now, I say this is the most interesting because this also had a Michael Jordan in it, so we know from previous videos that anytime Michael Jordan was in an insert set, the whole insert set ends up becoming a little bit more iconic often. So this one, Power in the Key, also had Michael Jordan. It was also, the Scoring Kings card was quite difficult to gem mint on. Actually, the Power in the Key was even harder to gem mint on. And while the Scoring Kings was 1 per 36 packs, this Power in the Key was actually 1 per 37 packs. So almost the same odds, actually slightly more rare. So you would think, if you were to look at this just from a mathematical standpoint, the fact that there's half the number of PSA 10s of the Power in the Key than there are of the Scoring Kings, and there's also about 75 less PSA 9s. The PSA 10, which only has a pop count of 45, goes for about $7,500. Still a lot of money, but that's half the price that a PSA 10 of the Scoring King would go for. And a PSA 9 will go for about $800, whereas the Scoring King will go for $2,500. So about a third of the price, but again, a much lower pop count and lower pack odds. So why is this? Now I'm gonna suggest there's two main things. One is the artistic aesthetic. People just really like the look of the Scoring Kings, and they don't have as much of that feeling when it comes to the Power in the Key cards. It's a perfectly fine looking card, but just doesn't stand out quite like the Scoring Kings in most people's mind, like from an artistic standpoint. And the second is narrative. This Scoring Kings card, for whatever reason, it's kind of been in collectors' mindset. It's been in the conversation about mid-90s inserts the whole time through. How that started, it was probably related to the artistic aesthetic, but whatever started it, there's a narrative around this card that makes it extra sought. It's on people's mind all the time. The Power in the Key, people forgot about it. So it's, the narrative isn't there. So those two things, artistic aesthetic and narrative. Now this is relevant to cards today. Now we can never know for sure what is the narrative that's going to surround certain cards long term, but it is something that we should be thinking about as we're making plans for the future, because that narrative, if it becomes a strong narrative, can sometimes last through and be a narrative that's remembered. Even if it's not completely accurate, if it's remembered, it can have an influence on the long-term value of that card. And similarly, we can't necessarily know what the next generation of sports card collectors is going to find aesthetically pleasing, but we can kind of get a sense a little bit based on some of the history. I mean, we can see the Scoring Kings card stands out. It's unique. It doesn't look the same as other cards, and there's something special about it. Are there certain cards nowadays that will have that same feeling long term? I don't know, but it's something to consider when you're thinking about long-term investment. Is this a kind of aesthetic that's going to be popular long term and not just popular right now? Now let's look at another example of this, because I think there's another way that we can kind of gain some learning from this also. Let's look here at the 95-96 Fleer Ultra Power cards. Now these were super common, 1 in every 4 packs. However, it also had the Gold Medallion edition, which was 1 in 40 packs. I'm mentioning this because sometimes, even if it was quite rare, like 1 in 40 packs is even more rare than the Scoring Kings, it's even more rare than the Power in the Key. It's the rarest of all these that we're looking at. It's actually one of the rarest from the Fleer Ultra series in that 95-96 year. However, the Gold Medallion edition, the most expensive card in the set, the Shaq card, can be found for under $5. Now, why is that? You'd think, based on the fact that it's so rare, 1 in 40 packs, that it would have some value today. Now, I would suggest the one big reason is the difference between that super common non-Gold Medallion edition and that super rare Gold Medallion edition is quite small artistically. From an aesthetic standpoint, it doesn't look that much different. So when somebody sees the Gold Medallion edition, even though it's super rare, the artistic aesthetic isn't any different than a pretty common card, a card that would actually probably you could find more commonly than even the Shaq base card, to be honest, because 1 in 4 packs and there was only, I don't know, maybe 10 people in it. So you were getting those Ultra Power cards quite commonly in packs. And even though you weren't getting the Gold Medallion edition, the Gold Medallion edition in a lot of collectors' mindset kind of gets lumped in as this kind of more common, less sought card, even though it's much more rare. So because of that, it's created this narrative that this is kind of an interesting, cool looking, cheap insert. card, and that if you see the gold medallion edition, you're not necessarily looking at that pack and saying, oh wow, this is rare. You're saying, oh, this is just, you know, some kind of parallel of a common card, whatever, it's not that valuable. And that's brought, that narrative, that mindset has brought the whole value down, despite the fact that it's quite a rare card. Now there's learning here that's relevant to modern cards also, as there is in all of these. Now what I think is the most direct kind of parallel here is when considering parallels of cards that are considered cheap, like cheap insert cards that have parallels. A silver parallel of this optic insert that's inserted quite common, or a purple parallel, or a hollow parallel of something that's really quite a common card. I have a feeling that long term, if that insert is considered cheap, not so interesting, you can find it for less than $1, then even if there's a rare unnumbered parallel that is more valuable and that is more rare, I don't think it's going to hold up long term in value just because its base card is considered so cheap. And nowadays, where insert sets are generally, not all of them, but generally inserts are considered cheaper than base cards. You know, you could get a parallel of those, and I have a feeling it will end up getting lumped into, oh, this is just an insert, it's just a simple parallel of an insert. It probably won't hold much value, even if it's a color parallel that's relatively uncommon. All right, number 3, sometimes rarity is not remembered accurately. If you look back at cards from the 1990s, even though most sets did include pack odds on the pack, it's not always the case that those pack odds are something that are remembered clearly in collectors' mindsets, and sometimes they're misremembered. As a result of this, sometimes there's cards that were relatively common that are actually more valuable than other cards that were relatively uncommon. And it's just because of how it's remembered, how it's misremembered. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. We're gonna look at 2 examples. First one we're gonna look at is the 95-96 Fleer Metal Slick Silver inserts, which are really cool looking, which I think helps their value. Now these ones hold quite a high value today, despite the fact that they were actually quite common at just 1 per 7 packs. That's a very common. I mean, in other sets, Fleer Metal is always a little higher than some of the other sets from that time, but you know, 1 in 7 packs is very low. I mean, it's very common. So why is it that this card still holds value? One is, of course, it just looks nice, and as we know before, you know, the artistic aesthetic can hold a value longer term, so that's definitely part of it. But the other, at least this is how I'm thinking about it, I think that this card in collectors' minds is more rare than it actually was. It's remembered as being a more rare card for whatever reason. It just seems that way. You don't see it around that much. So it seems like it's a more rare card, despite the fact that the math says it's really not a rare card. So the fact that a PSA 10 of the Jordan of this Slick Silver can cost $600 feels like it doesn't match. It doesn't match the kind of price that would happen on a PSA 10 of other cards, of other inserts that are this common. On the other hand, there's occasions where the exact opposite can happen as well. Take, for example, this 94-95 Skybox Premium Center Stage cards. Now, despite the fact that these were inserted at a rate of just 1 per 72 packs, extremely rare, it's possible to find the most expensive card from this set, the Shat card, for under $10. Now, that is an extremely inexpensive card that also looks amazing and that was really hard to get your hands on. But this set has one major thing going against it. The year before, in 93-94, the Center Stage cards were inserted at a rate of 1 per 12 packs. Much more common, 6 times more common. So the Jordan in that set can be found raw for about $10. Which, looking at Slick Silver, actually, that even that seems a little bit low, especially how cool this card is. But the fact that the 93-94, the Jordan relatively common insert could be found for $10, it's affected the next year, 94-95, despite the fact it was 6 times more rare. 1 in every 2 boxes, 1 in every 72 packs, very rare. The Shat card rarely goes over $10. And I think that's largely because in collectors' minds, the 93-94 and 94-95 get lumped together, despite the fact one is rare and one is not. So it's not always about rarity, it's about how things are remembered in people's minds. So what could this mean in relation to modern cards as we move forward? Well, the first thing that jumps to mind to me is I think that most non-numbered colored parallels are gonna end up getting lumped together in collectors' minds. Ones that are slightly more common, ones that are slightly less common will get lumped together as just the unnumbered colored parallel. And this might not stay true to some of the more unique ones, the ones that are harder to get, like a Cosmic, for example, which you have a specific unique way to even get those ones. Those ones are probably not gonna be lumped in quite the same. But a lot of the other ones, you know, it won't be remembered. If this particular green, purple select, or this particular cracked ice, or this particular red prism, if they're unnumbered, some of them might be more common, some of them might be less common, but I have a feeling that won't really be remembered long term. The numbered ones will be, but the unnumbered ones generally will get lumped together, I think, which means that some of the more rare colored parallels, I think, will come down to the value of some of the more common color parallels. Number 4, be extra gentle with cards that have a sensitive foil and/or that are die cut. When looking back on the cards in the 1990s, some of the cards that hold the most value today are those that are difficult to keep in perfect condition. Valuable 90s inserts like Precious Metal Gems, 93-94 Fleer Ultra Scoring Kings, A Cut Above, Flair Showcase Hot Shots, 97-98 Fleer Metal Planet Metal, among others, are particularly hard to gem mint, which today means that those that do get a PSA 10 are worth a premium. Some of these sets were very rare to begin with, some less so, but all of them have proven very difficult to gem mint. In these examples and in many others, the two most common reasons are either 1, it has a sensitive foil on it, which over time can flake off easily, or number 2, it was a die cut, and die cut, the way that it's cut, it's difficult to keep in good condition. It's difficult to come out of the factory in good condition even. So those two examples oftentimes are difficult to gem mint. Now there's a couple of lessons related to this, one that's kind of obvious and one that's a little less obvious. The obvious lesson here is be careful with your cards, especially those that are sensitive, those that have a foil, those that are die cut. That's the obvious lesson, but there's a little bit of a less obvious lesson here too. There might be some investment potential in finding cards that are difficult to gem mint now and holding on to them a little bit longer term. For example, thick stock cards are notoriously difficult to PSA 10. If you can find a good quality, highly sought thick stock card that does PSA 10, more likely that's going to hold a premium long term once collectors really see, oh wow, like the pop count of PSA 10s in this card is really, really low. This is going to be a sought card. So I think thick stock is one to keep in mind. Cards that are black, because it's also pretty clear that when the cards have a black background, the edges, any edge damage becomes very, very obvious. So it's difficult for those to PSA 10. So if you do have a black card, a thick card that's black, that gets a PSA 10, that's actually a sought card. I think that one could hold value long term. Or if it has a foil on it, if it has, some of those noir rookies, for example, some of those noir rookie cards have thick stock, black, most of it, with like some kind of gold trim. That's 3 different things that are difficult to keep in good condition long term. So if you can get one of those noir rookie cards that's PSA 10, and all 3 of those things are PSA 10 worthy, that's a rare card actually, even more rare than the number might suggest. Even if it's a card that's out of 99 or out of 299, if it's a PSA 10, that's going to end up probably being a card that's out of 10 or something like that long term. So that could really fetch a premium as a long-term investment, I would guess. Number 5, not a lot of players hold long-term value, even really good players, even Hall of Fame quality kind of players. When we look back through the history of sports cards, it seems as if each generation has its main highlights that are thought of when thinking about cards at the time. And the players who aren't among that small handful of names, their values end up usually going quite low, even if that player has a Hall of Fame caliber career. If you look, for example, I'm always looking at examples in basketball most often because that's where I've been a collector most of my life. If you look at in the 1980s and the 1990s, of course, you see Michael Jordan, for example, his cards are always very valuable. And in that generation, let's say mid 80s to mid 90s, there's a couple other players whose cards are part of the conversation. A Shaq card is usually in there, a Barkley and a Olajuwon, but there's a lot of other Hall of Famers whose cards have really dipped a lot. I mean, you look at John Stockton, you look at Clyde Drexler, you look at David Robinson, Patrick Ewing. You've got some phenomenal players in there who have cards that are very low valued, even compared to other players of their generation. Now, why is that? Now, it seems that there's always just a few, 5 or less, from each generation that kind of keep in the hobby in a more deep way. After Jordan era, once Kobe had his rookie season, he became kind of that he held that Michael Jordan role in the sports card hobby for the next period of time. And a few other players, perhaps, Shaq continued up through there in the late 90s. I don't know, maybe Kevin Garnett a little bit, but not even him, not even Kevin Garnett, not even Tim Duncan. So there was that. And then once LeBron James came around, then his cards had that. And then from the last 20 years, maybe in that first decade of the 2000s, you have the Steph Curry, the Kevin Durant. Those guys, I have a feeling they'll They'll be relevant in the same way that some of the Olajuwons and Barkleys were from the late 80s, early 90s. But there's going to be a lot of modern players who fall into that Clyde Drexler space that are phenomenal players. I mean, Clyde Drexler was probably the second best shooting guard in the NBA at the time of Michael Jordan. He was fantastic. His cards are worth very little. The same could be said about a lot of players today. I mean, who knows what the long-term outlook on somebody like Devin Booker might be. He's a phenomenal player, but I wouldn't be surprised if he falls into that Clyde Drexler space. He's not going to be the LeBron James space. He's not going to be the Kobe Bryant space. Could he fall into the Clyde Drexler space, which is a Hall of Fame caliber career, one of the best of all time kind of careers, but within the hobby maybe won't mean that much long-term. It seems very possible. It seems like each generation has less than 5, and if in the first decade of the 2000s, it's LeBron James, Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, that's about it. From the next decade, maybe Giannis, who else? I don't know. Jokic, I don't know. I mean, he's a unique player, but I don't even know about him. Luka, maybe. People seem to want that to be. It's possible. But probably no more than like 5. And some of the players who don't make that list of 5 are going to be all-time greats. Embiid is probably going to be remembered as one of the best centers of this time, but so is Patrick Ewing. So is David Robinson. And their cards don't hold up in value nowadays. So I think that'll happen. Maybe even to Jokic. I mean, maybe he has a little bit of a unique style of play, so maybe he'll be in the mix a little bit more, but it's hard to say for sure. And the number 6. Early hype can lead to the market eventually crashing on that player's card's long-term value. Now, I'm thinking I might make an entire video of this phenomenon later, because there's a lot of examples of this actually. But sometimes if a player is extremely hyped up right out the gate, that unless that player ends up being like an all-time, greatest of all time type of player, his cards are going to crash at some point. And in fact, that initial hype that made their cards so valuable right out the gate is actually going to be the source that causes that crash later. If a player doesn't reach to be the next MJ or the next greatest point guard of all time or the next Ken Griffey Jr. or something like that, at some point there's going to be an exodus of people in that card. Even if that player's career is amazing, even if that player is a multiple all-star, even if that player has a borderline Hall of Fame career, their cards at some point are probably going to start to be sold off. Now, I've been doing research recently on players who came into their professional sport with incredible hype. And for many of them, even if they did end up having really solidly good careers, like multiple all-stars, if they were a kind of player that had like a Michael Jordan level of hype, then they're almost deemed a failure even if they have a great career. And this can hurt the value of their cards extremely. There's a number of examples that we could look into related to this. I mean, I think in baseball, everybody looks at Greg Jeffries, for example. In basketball, there's a number of names you could look at, but let's just look at Jerry Stackhouse, for example. So when Stackhouse was drafted 3rd in the 1995 NBA draft, expectations for him were extremely high. As a 6'6" shooting guard coming out of North Carolina, he was considered to be the next Michael Jordan. And he came out the gate really strong as well. He averaged 19 points per game his rookie season. His next year, he averaged more than 20 points per game. His card values were increasing. They were some of the most sought cards of that time. He was the guy that most people were seeking. If a few years earlier, people had been doing that with Anthony Hardaway, a few years after that with Grant Hill, and now with Jerry Stackhouse. And really all 3 of these players, you could say the same about all 3 of these players, their card values were extremely high. Their hype was extremely high. And all 3 of those are good examples actually, because they all had excellent careers. Jerry Stackhouse had one season where he averaged 29.8 points per game, was second in scoring next to Allen Iverson. He only made the All-Star team twice, but still that's pretty solid. And he had a 20-year career, and he was impactful for quite a number of those years. He had a good career. There's no way to say he didn't have a good career. He had a good career. But his cards, when he didn't reach the level of expectation that was given to him, along the way, a lot of people had an exodus of his cards. They wanted to get rid of him. They said, okay, this guy's not going to be Michael Jordan. Let me sell his cards. And then as soon as more people started doing that, the price started going down, 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 and it could never recover. Now, this is the problem with hype, was so many people are buying, the prices go so high, and at some point, bunch of people are like, okay, this is not going to hold value long term, let's start selling. And then the prices just start going down like crazy, and they don't ever recover from that because he didn't have a Michael Jordan style of career. Now, so this is dangerous to get into hype like that, because you can see if Jerry Stackhouse, for example, had been a late first round pick and had kind of been unexpected and didn't have that hype, I have a feeling his cards would have gotten to some kind of level that they would have been at that would have been reasonable. They wouldn't have had big downs, they wouldn't have had big ups, they would have been just somewhere in the middle there and would have remained there. But because of this hype, it brought it up so high and then it crashed it back down. So I think that that hype is really, really dangerous. So nowadays, you know, I get worried about like LaMelo Ball's cards, for example, Wander Franco in baseball. I mean, these guys could have amazing careers. LaMelo Ball could be a 5-time All-Star and his cards values are still gonna crash at some point because his values are at the point where he basically has to become one of the top 2 or 3 best point guards of all time in order for his cards to be at this value. And even if he was a top 5 point guard of all time, his cards still might end up going down. So, you know, you gotta be careful about hype, and you can look at that clearly when you look at the 1990s. All right, with all that being said, that's all we have for this video. It's got kind of long. Again, whenever I have these videos where I'm just looking at you, I end up going off the cuff a bit, and a video I expect to be like 10 minutes ends up being much longer, but that's all right. So if you're still along here and you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. I'm clawing and scratching to get to that 500K, that 500 subscriber mark, then that 1K mark. This is tough to get an audience, so please do subscribe to the channel. I hope this is valuable for you. Peace. Check you later.